The late afternoon sun draped the small town in soft golden light, casting long shadows over the cobblestone street where Margaret's bakery stood. From the outside, Sweet Haven looked modest, a quaint building with cream-colored walls, flower boxes bursting with geraniums, and a hand-painted wooden sign that had faded slightly over the years. To Margaret, however, it was more than just a bakery. It was the embodiment of her life's devotion. 40 years of early mornings, flour-dusted aprons, and quiet prayers whispered over rising dough. Margaret was 60 years old, though her spirit often felt younger despite the lines etched across her face. She had a sturdy build, softened slightly by age, and carried herself with quiet dignity. Her silver-streaked brown hair was always pulled back neatly into a bun, strands of it escaping whenever she worked near the ovens. Her hands were rough, from decades of kneading bread, yet her touch was always gentle when she shaped pastries or wiped tears from her daughter's cheeks. To the townspeople, she was both admired and envied, the woman who had built something lasting while raising what appeared to be the perfect family. Her husband Edward often stood at her side during community events, though in truth he spent most of his time away from the bakery. Edward was 63, tall and broad-shouldered, with once dark hair now turned steel gray. His deep-set brown eyes gave him a serious, almost stern look, softened only by his well-trimmed beard. Once, Edward had been a carpenter, known for his craftsmanship and fairness. But after an accident that damaged his hand years ago, he had withdrawn from physical work, retreating into long walks and evenings with his books. Though he loved Margaret in his own way, there was always a sense of distance about him, as if part of his soul had closed after the accident. To others, Edward looked like the ideal patriarch, reliable and dignified, but Margaret often sensed a restlessness in him, a longing for something unspoken. Their daughters were their pride, at least to anyone looking from the outside. Clara, the eldest, was 35 and lived in the next town over with her husband and 2 young children. Clara had inherited Margaret's warm smile and wide, expressive eyes, but her figure was leaner, her auburn hair flowing freely past her shoulders. Practical and empathetic, she worked as a teacher at a local elementary school. Whenever she visited the bakery, she brought an air of calm reassurance, hugging her mother with genuine warmth and helping out with customers as though she had never left. Clara was the kind of woman who listened intently, who noticed when someone's tone shifted, and who carried burdens silently to avoid adding weight to her loved ones' lives. Emily, the younger daughter, was 28 and had recently married Michael, a man who seemed to charm everyone he met. Emily was striking in a different way from her sister. She had delicate features, long blonde hair she often styled with care, and pale blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled. Unlike Clara's grounded presence, Emily carried herself with an air of ambition, always reaching for more than what was offered. She had a quick wit and enjoyed being admired, often slipping into the center of attention effortlessly. Margaret adored Emily, but sometimes worried about her restlessness, her desire for recognition that seemed never to be fully satisfied. Michael, Emily's new husband, had quickly made his presence known in town. At 30, he was tall with an athletic frame, his dark hair always neatly combed, his jaw sharp, and his smile persuasive. He dressed well for someone in a small town, his suits always pressed, his shoes polished. To the neighbors, Michael was attentive and polite, quick to compliment and shake hands, the model son-in-law. Yet Margaret, observant by nature, had already noticed something beneath his charm, a calculating pause before he spoke, a flicker of irritation in his eyes when things did not go his way. He carried himself like a man used to convincing others, used to bending situations to his advantage, though most people only saw his charm. On this particular afternoon, Margaret wiped down the counter of her bakery as the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Henderson, a round, cheerful woman with silver curls, entered to buy her usual loaf of rye bread. "You're blessed, Margaret," she said warmly, glancing at the framed family photo hanging on the wall. Margaret, Edward, Clara, Emily, and Michael, smiling together during the wedding. "Such a perfect family. Everyone talks about how lucky you are." Margaret returned the smile, though inside she felt a pang. Perfect family. She had heard those words countless times, and each time they left her unsettled. Was it perfect? Or was it just the picture they all wanted to believe? That evening, Margaret prepared dinner at home. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen as Edward set the table, his movements quiet and deliberate. Clara had arrived earlier with her children, who were now playing in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. Emily and Michael arrived shortly after, Michael carrying a bottle of wine, Emily with her usual flair of hugging her father dramatically before helping her mother with the salad. The house felt full, alive with voices, the image of unity. Yet as Margaret watched them interact, her heart stirred uneasily. Michael spoke animatedly about his new business ideas, his hands gesturing as if painting pictures of opportunity in the air. Edward listened intently, nodding, while Emily's laughter chimed like bells as she supported her husband's vision. Clara, however, remained quieter, her eyes flickering toward her mother as if sensing the same undercurrent of tension. As the night went on, Margaret caught snippets of whispers when the others thought she wasn't listening. Michael speaking lowly to Edward about future prospects, Emily brushing off Clara's concerns about family priorities. Margaret felt as if threads she had spent a lifetime weaving were being tugged loose, one by one. She smiled when spoken to, refilled glasses, and complimented Michael on his plans. But inside, she wondered if perfection was just a mask her family wore for the town, while hidden fractures spread beneath the surface. Later, when the house was quiet and the dishes done, Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the bakery across the street. The lights were off, but the sign still swung gently in the evening breeze. She pressed her hand against the glass, a silent promise to protect what she had built. The whispers of doubt echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside. For now, she told herself, the family was still intact. For now, the image of perfection remained, even if cracks lingered behind it. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets glistening with a silvery sheen under the late afternoon sun, the kind of light that makes everything look deceptively beautiful, as though the world itself were trying to hide the truth beneath a coat of gold. Inside the bakery, Margaret sat quietly at the small wooden table near the back, sipping a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea. She was 60 years old, with fine silver strands threading through her once dark hair and soft wrinkles etched at the corners of her hazel eyes that still carried warmth, but also a growing shadow of worry. Her hands, though still steady, bore the faint tremors of years of kneading dough, shaping pastries, and holding together more than just bread. For Margaret, the bakery was not simply a business, it was her sanctuary, the place where she had poured decades of her heart and soul. Every tray of cinnamon rolls or loaf of bread represented her devotion, a lifetime of effort and sacrifice. She had raised her daughters, Clara and Emily, within its walls, letting the smell of freshly baked bread be the background music of their childhood. But lately, there were cracks forming in the life she thought was unshakable. That afternoon, as Margaret was carrying a box of flour bags toward the pantry, she heard low voices coming from Edward's office at the back of the bakery. The door was only slightly ajar. Her husband, Edward, tall and broad-shouldered even at 62, with a square jaw that had softened over the years, was sitting across from Michael, Emily's husband. Edward was a man who had always commanded respect. His presence filled every room, though time had hardened him into someone more pragmatic and stern than the boyishly charming man she had once fallen in love with. Michael, in contrast, was only in his early 30s. He was handsome in a polished way, with neatly combed brown hair, a clean-shaven face, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to carry ambition more than warmth. He dressed meticulously, as if every detail mattered. A man who wanted to be seen as successful, controlled, important. Margaret had never disliked him, but she never trusted him completely either. He was polite, almost too polite, and his compliments often felt rehearsed. "The bakery has real potential, Edward," Michael was saying, his voice confident, persuasive. "With your name and reputation, and with some investment, we could expand. Think bigger, more branches, more reach. But to make it work, we'd need to transfer the business under our management officially. Legal ownership would streamline everything." Margaret froze in the hallway, her heart thudding against her ribs. Transfer the bakery? Under their management? Her bakery? Edward's response was a low rumble, thoughtful but not dismissive. "It's a big decision, Michael. You know Margaret. This place is her life. She won't let go of it easily." Michael leaned forward, his voice lowering, though Margaret could still hear the edge of insistence. "I understand, but times are changing. Small businesses like this can't survive without adapting. Emily and I can carry the legacy forward. You and Margaret deserve to rest, to enjoy life without worrying about flour deliveries and ovens." Margaret's hands clenched around the flour bag, her nails digging into the paper until it crumpled slightly. Her sanctuary, her work, her identity, was it being discussed like some old piece of property to be passed on? Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, and she pulled back from the door before either of them noticed her. That evening, Emily came by the bakery briefly, her presence as fleeting as a shadow. Margaret's younger daughter was 28, slender with long auburn hair that framed her pale face. Once bright and affectionate, Emily had grown distant since her marriage. She often wore chic clothes, far more polished than what Margaret had seen her wear before, and she carried herself with an air of impatience now, as though her mother's world was too small, too insignificant for her. "I can't stay, Mom," Emily said quickly when Margaret tried to ask about dinner plans. "Michael and I have meetings tomorrow morning. We're busy, maybe next week." She kissed Margaret's cheek lightly, almost perfunctorily, then disappeared through the bakery's glass door, leaving the smell of rain and coffee behind. Margaret stood there watching her daughter walk away, her heart aching in a way she couldn't describe. She longed for the days when Emily would help her frost cupcakes, giggling as she smeared icing on her nose. Now, Emily seemed to belong to another world entirely, a world Margaret wasn't invited into. That night, fatigue overtook Margaret while she was mixing dough for the morning. The kitchen felt unusually warm, the hum of the ovens blending with the pounding of her heart. She suddenly felt dizzy, her vision blurring as her knees buckled. The world tilted, and she collapsed onto the tiled floor. When she opened her eyes, the room was dim, and she felt the cool press of a hand against hers. Clara was kneeling beside her, tears streaking down her cheeks. Clara, the eldest daughter, was 35, with chestnut hair pulled back into a practical bun and a strong, dependable build. She had always been Margaret's anchor, steady, kind, and loyal, even if her life was busy with her own husband and 2 children. "Mom, you scared me," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "You were on the floor. I thought—" She swallowed hard, unable to finish the thought, squeezing her mother's hand tighter. Margaret tried to sit up, but Clara gently pressed her back. "Rest, please. You need to rest." The sight of Clara's distress softened Margaret's fear. Yet Clara's next words cut her deeper than any fall could. "Mom, things aren't right. Dad, Emily, they've changed. They're not the same. It's like they don't see you anymore. It's like the bakery doesn't mean to them what it means to us. Margaret's throat closed up, emotion storming inside her. She had felt it too. The distance, the dismissive glances, the subtle shifts in loyalty. But hearing Clara say it aloud made it real, undeniable. She stared at her daughter, searching her eyes for comfort, but instead found confirmation of her worst fears. Margaret pressed her lips together, nodding faintly as tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth she had been pushing away. The perfect family she thought she had built was slowly fracturing, and she didn't know if she could hold it together much longer. The morning fog lingered low over the town, wrapping rooftops and chimneys in a gray veil as the bakery lights flickered on against the dim sky. Margaret unlocked the door with her usual precision, her fingers trembling only slightly as she turned the brass key. She had always loved the quiet hour before sunrise, when the streets were silent and the ovens hummed to life, when flour dust danced like snowflakes in the first beams of light through the windows. But today, the stillness pressed heavier on her chest, an omen she couldn't quite shake. At 60, Margaret carried herself with quiet dignity, but she could feel the slow creep of exhaustion beneath her skin. Every day the work seemed heavier, her daughters more distant, and her husband less like the man who once courted her with laughter and promises. She adjusted her apron and tried to silence the echo of Clara's warning words. Dad and Emily aren't the same anymore. It wasn't long before Emily and Michael arrived, earlier than usual. Emily swept in first, her auburn hair gleaming under the bakery's lights, her slender frame accentuated by a tailored beige coat. Her green eyes flickered toward her mother with a fleeting smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a sharpness that unsettled Margaret. Michael followed close behind, crisp as ever in a navy suit despite the flour-dusted setting, his polished shoes clacking against the wooden floor. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room like an investor evaluating assets, not a family place of comfort. "Mom, you should sit today," Emily said, her voice measured, too calm. "Michael and I can handle the ovens. You've been overworking yourself." Margaret hesitated, sensing something rehearsed in her daughter's tone. "I've been baking before you were born," she replied softly, but she allowed herself to retreat to the corner table, curiosity pricking at her chest. Michael busied himself with the oven controls, his movements deliberate. Margaret noticed how he glanced at Emily, who gave a subtle nod. The smell of gas grew faintly in the air, but before Margaret could react, a sharp crack rang out, followed by a sudden flare. Flames licked briefly at the edge of the oven before dying back under Michael's swift, dramatic response. He yanked the controls, muttering, "Good God, Margaret, did you forget to shut it off last night?" His tone was loud, sharp, meant for Edward's ears as much as hers. Emily gasped and put a hand to her chest, her green eyes wide in mock alarm. "Mom, you could have burned the whole place down." Margaret's heart lurched, shame and disbelief clashing in her mind. She knew. She had turned the oven off. It was ritual, a sacred part of closing every night. But Edward had entered the bakery just in time to hear the accusation. Edward, tall and imposing even with the slump of age, still carried the air of a man used to authority. His graying hair was neatly combed, his brown eyes stern but tired. He had once been Margaret's shield, her partner in every trial. Now he frowned, deep lines creasing his forehead as he turned toward her. "Margaret," he said heavily, disappointment dripping from his voice, "this isn't the first time you've been careless lately. Maybe Clara's right. You need rest." The betrayal in his tone felt like a knife. Margaret wanted to scream, to insist on the truth, but her throat closed with emotion. Clara burst through the door just then, carrying a tray of jam jars she had promised to bring from her pantry. Her eyes swept the tense scene, her gaze narrowing as she spotted the unnatural calm between Emily and Michael. Clara was a woman of strong build and practical beauty, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid and sleeves rolled up from helping her children before coming here. She set the tray down with a thud. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice firm. Emily sighed, exchanging a look with Michael before turning to her sister. "Mom almost caused a fire. She left the oven running last night." Clara's face hardened, her brown eyes flashing with disbelief. "No, she didn't. Don't you dare put this on her." Clara crossed her arms, her stance protective. She had always been Margaret's defender, the one who still saw the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the heart her mother poured into every loaf of bread. But Edward cut in, his tone final. "Clara, enough. We can't deny the signs. Your mother's getting forgetful. It's not safe for her to manage everything alone anymore." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. Her husband, her daughter, her son-in-law, they were weaving a narrative that painted her as weak, incapable, no longer the heart of the bakery she had built. Clara's face flushed with anger, but Margaret reached out, gently resting a flour-dusted hand on her eldest's wrist. "It's all right, darling," she whispered, though her eyes shimmered with tears. Inside, though, a storm raged. How could they? How could Edward, the man who had watched me build this place brick by brick, stand against me? How could Emily, my own daughter, betray me so easily? That night, long after the bakery had closed and silence hung heavy in the air, Margaret sat alone in the back office. The shadows stretched long across the wooden desk, and the ticking of the old wall clock was the only sound. She pulled a small leather-bound notebook from a drawer. Its pages were crisp, untouched. With trembling hands, she began to write. Every word, every incident, every slight, she would record it all. The oven, accident, Edward's disappointment, Emily's coldness, Michael's manipulations. If they thought her weak, she would show them her strength in silence. As her pen scratched across the page, Margaret's heart hardened. She would not let them steal her life's work under the guise of care and concern. If her own family was plotting against her, then she would meet them not with confrontation, but with quiet, undeniable proof. She paused, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The bakery behind her looked fragile in its slumber, but she knew it was not the bakery that was crumbling. It was her family, and she would fight in her own way to protect what was hers. The evening sky burned orange and crimson as the town's community hall filled with voices, the autumn air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Folding chairs squeaked against the wooden floor. Neighbors settled in with murmurs of anticipation, and the banners overhead read in bold letters, "Food Safety and Community Standards." Margaret sat near the front, her palms clammy, her notebook clutched inside her worn leather bag. She had attended countless meetings over the years, always as the respected baker who supplied bread for school events and cakes for weddings. But tonight, she sensed she was not here as a neighbor or artisan. Tonight, she was the target. Margaret adjusted her shawl, a knitted, cream-colored wrap Clara had given her last winter, and tried to steady her breathing. Every rustle of paper, every whisper in the hall seemed magnified in her ears. She felt like prey in the moments before the first strike. Emily and Michael entered together, moving with a confidence that unsettled Margaret. Emily, in a tailored gray dress that made her look older than her 30 years, exuded an air of authority. Her auburn hair coiled into a perfect bun. She carried a folder under one arm and wore an expression of controlled concern, as if preparing to save the community from a looming disaster. Beside her, Michael projected polished charm, his square jaw clean-shaven, his navy suit freshly pressed. His eyes, a piercing blue, flickered with satisfaction at the hushed attention they commanded. Margaret's chest tightened. These were not the children she remembered nurturing. Emily, with flour on her cheeks as a child, Michael with a nervous smile when he first asked for her daughter's hand. They were strangers now, predators in fine clothing. Edward shuffled into the hall moments later, wearing his best brown jacket, his tie slightly askew. His face was drawn, his once proud shoulders hunched as though the burden of conflict weighed him down. He avoided Margaret's gaze, choosing instead to sit beside Emily and Michael. The sight carved into Margaret's heart like a blade, but she swallowed her hurt, reminding herself she had prepared for this moment. Clara had arrived earlier, slipping quietly into the second row. She wore a dark blouse and her hair in a simple braid, her strong hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were locked on her sister and brother-in-law with simmering suspicion. At the podium, Mr. Allen, the community hall moderator, cleared his throat. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with salt and pepper hair, known for his fairness in town debates. His presence usually brought Margaret comfort, but tonight, even his calm demeanor could not ease her dread. "Thank you all for gathering," Mr. Allen began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "We're here to address concerns raised about local food establishments. We'll allow time for comments and evidence, so let us proceed respectfully." Emily stood first, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Thank you, Mr. Allen," she said, her voice steady and clear. She turned to face the audience, her gaze sweeping across familiar faces, neighbors, customers, even childhood friends. "I take no pleasure in this, but it must be said. My mother, Margaret, has been struggling. She's forgotten to turn off ovens, left ingredients spoiled, and endangered customers' safety. As much as it pains me, she is no longer capable of running the bakery responsibly." Murmurs rippled through the hall, heads turning, whispers hissing like snakes. Margaret's throat tightened as shame burned her cheeks. She wanted to shout that it was all lies, but her voice refused to rise. Michael stepped forward smoothly, adding his weight to Emily's accusation. "I've personally witnessed instances of negligence," he said, his tone grave. "The oven nearly caused a fire just last week. If Clara hadn't walked in, who knows what would have happened? We all love Margaret, but love doesn't excuse risk. The town deserves better." His words struck the hall with deliberate force, each syllable crafted to erode Margaret's reputation. She glanced at Edward, hoping for a flicker of defense, but he only looked down, his jaw tight, his silence speaking louder than any betrayal. Margaret's vision blurred, her chest aching as though a band tightened around her ribs. The faces of neighbors who had once smiled warmly at her now shifted with doubt. She gripped her bag tighter, the notebook inside pulsing like a heartbeat. Her instinct screamed at her to stand, to defend herself, but before she could rise, a chair scraped loudly. Clara stood. The room stilled. Clara's presence was not polished like Emily's, nor rehearsed like Michael's, but it carried raw, undeniable strength. Her chestnut hair gleamed under the lights, her brow furrowed with conviction. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp. "You've twisted the truth long enough." All eyes turned to her as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with fury. "Mom may not fight back, but I will." With a quick motion, she connected her phone to the projector by the podium. The screen flickered, then stabilized, displaying shaky video footage. The hall gasped as the scene unfolded. Michael deliberately tampering with the bakery's mixer, loosening bolts until the machine shuddered violently during use. The video cut to Emily in the storefront, clutching her stomach theatrically and collapsing into a chair, feigning illness while sympathetic customers gathered around. Clara's voice rang out, breaking the stunned silence. "This is your evidence. Not that Mom is incapable, but that you are sabotaging her. Gasps echoed through the hall. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, whispers turning to outrage. Margaret's heart raced, relief flooding through her veins like water. Breaking a dam. She had been recording, observing, preparing. But it was Clara's courage that had brought the truth into the light. She looked at her eldest daughter with pride and gratitude so fierce, it brought tears to her eyes. Emily's face drained of color, her composure cracking as murmurs of shameful and disgraceful swept through the crowd. Michael's jaw tightened, his eyes darting around for an escape, but the community's judgment pressed in from all sides. Mr. Allen raised a hand for quiet, his expression stern. "This is serious," he declared. "The evidence speaks for itself. Margaret, it seems you've been the victim, not the danger." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building as voices rose in Margaret's defense. "We trust you, Margaret," one woman called. "You fed this town for years," shouted another. Margaret's tears spilled freely, not of shame this time, but of vindication. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and faced the crowd. The voices washed over her like balm, easing the sting of betrayal. But even as relief took root, her eyes fell on Edward. He sat rigid, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had heard the evidence, seen the truth, yet he did not move to her side. His silence cut deeper than Emily's lies or Michael's schemes. And in that silence, Margaret understood. She had won the community's support, but she had lost her husband's loyalty. The early morning mist still clung to the rooftops, softening the outlines of the little town that had just witnessed a scandal tearing through its heart. Margaret awoke before dawn, her chest heavy with the ache of betrayal, but also with a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years. She pulled on her modest gray cardigan, the wool slightly frayed at the elbows, and stared at her reflection in the small oval mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back was aged, her face etched with lines of sorrow and endurance, but her eyes, blue-gray, tired yet sharp, still carried a spark of resilience. She whispered to herself, almost as if to reaffirm, "This is not the end." By mid-morning, the bakery bell rang more times than it had in months. People who once turned away, influenced by Emily and Michael's poisonous whispers, now crowded the narrow shop in a surge of support. Margaret could barely keep up with the orders, her arthritic hands moving slower than they once did. But Clara was at her side, her daughter's youthful energy filling in the gaps. Clara, with her long auburn hair pulled into a ponytail and flour dusting her apron, moved quickly between customers, her warm smile disarming even the most skeptical faces. For Margaret, seeing her daughter beam with such pride rekindled a feeling she had thought lost, the sense that her family legacy might endure after all. Each exchange with customers was not merely about bread or pastries. It was about dignity being restored. An older man, Mr. Davies, stooped with a cane, and his white hair in disarray, leaned across the counter and said, "Margaret, I always knew you weren't the one making mistakes. I'm sorry I ever doubted you." His voice carried genuine remorse. Margaret, holding his receipt, managed a shaky smile, blinking back tears. Every apology from a neighbor felt like a bandage pressed against an invisible wound. News of the scandal spread faster than the sweet smell of fresh bread. In the small town, reputations were currency, and Emily and Michael found themselves bankrupt in that sense. Neighbors who once waved politely now turned cold, whispers following them wherever they went. Michael, with his square jaw always freshly shaved and once proud posture, began walking with shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. Emily, whose beauty had often been her weapon, tall, slim, with glossy dark hair and a smile designed to charm, now appeared hollow-eyed, her once confident stride broken into hurried steps. Their fall was swift, and it wasn't long before the decision was made to leave town. Margaret heard it from Mrs. Pritchard, a sharp-tongued woman in her late 60s who ran the post office. She came into the bakery one morning, with her gray curls bouncing under a knitted hat, and said in her loud, matter-of-fact tone, "They've packed up. Couldn't stand the looks they were getting. Headed out before sunrise." She shook her head with a mix of pity and satisfaction. Margaret felt a strange mixture inside her chest, relief that the source of her torment was gone, but also a gnawing sadness that her daughter had chosen deception and betrayal over loyalty and truth. Edward's absence cut deeper. After the scandal broke, he had stood silent, neither defending Margaret nor denouncing Emily and Michael. His once strong figure, tall, broad-shouldered with thinning silver hair, now carried an air of defeat. Without a word of goodbye, he packed a suitcase and left to stay with Emily. The empty side of the bed haunted Margaret each night, and though anger flickered inside her, it was grief that dominated her heart. The man she had built a life with, shared laughter and hardships with, had chosen to abandon her in her moment of vindication. Clara noticed the hollowness in her mother's eyes during the quiet hours after the shop closed. She would place a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder and say softly, "We still have each other, Mama. And this bakery, it's ours again." Clara's words were a lifeline, and Margaret clung to them, drawing strength not only from her daughter's presence, but from her belief that a rebuilding was still possible. In the weeks that followed, the bakery became more than just a place to buy bread. It became a symbol of resilience for the community. Local children darted in after school, their laughter ringing against the glass windows as they begged for Margaret's famous cinnamon rolls. Young couples came for loaves, exchanging tender glances that reminded Margaret of her early days with Edward, back when love seemed unshakable. Even strangers from nearby towns began visiting, drawn by the story of a woman who had endured humiliation and betrayal only to rise again with dignity intact. Margaret poured herself into the work. Her hands trembled less with each passing day, strengthened by the rhythm of kneading dough, by the familiar comfort of flour dust in the air. She began to notice small joys again, the way the morning sun spilled through the bakery's front window, the soft murmur of Clara humming while arranging pastries, the sound of satisfied customers leaving with warm bread tucked under their arms. Each of these details stitched her fractured spirit together piece by piece. At night, when the shop was finally quiet, Margaret would sit in the back kitchen with a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and memories pressed heavily on her heart. She would think of Edward, his laughter once booming through the same space, and wonder if he regretted leaving. She would think of Emily as a little girl, bright-eyed and eager to help roll out dough, and question where the sweetness in her had gone. These thoughts pierced her, but she refused to let them undo her. Instead, she whispered to herself, "The glass may have cracked, but it did not shatter. I'm still here." For Clara, the scandal had strengthened her resolve. She had always felt overshadowed by Emily, who was more charming and favored by Edward, but now she saw her own worth reflected in her mother's gratitude and the town's newfound respect. Late one evening, she told Margaret, her green eyes glistening with determination, "We'll make this bakery better than ever. I promise you, Mama, no one will take this away from us again." Margaret, her throat too tight to speak, simply reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. The path ahead was uncertain. Margaret knew life would never return to what it once was. Too much had been broken. But as she watched Clara smile at a group of children pressing their noses against the bakery's window the next morning, she realized that sometimes healing was not about restoring the past, but about building something new, something stronger. out of the ruins. And for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The morning sun stretched golden rays across the cobbled street, and the bakery's front windows glimmered with a warmth that seemed to promise new beginnings. Inside, the air was rich with the comforting aroma of cinnamon, butter, and rising dough. Margaret leaned against the counter, watching Clara bustle about with a liveliness that made the bakery feel more like a place of joy than a place of labor. Yet beneath the fragrance of fresh bread and the hum of laughter that now often filled the shop, a quiet ache sat heavy in Margaret's chest, an unshakable reminder of what she had lost. It was Clara who first suggested the idea of holding baking classes. She had noticed how people lingered after buying their loaves, how they leaned across the counter with curiosity in their eyes, asking questions about recipes and techniques. "Mama," Clara had said one evening, her auburn hair falling loose from its bun as she sat at the kitchen table sketching ideas on a scrap of paper, "why don't we open the bakery to the town in a different way? We could host classes, bring people together, let them learn. This bakery could be more than just ours. It could belong to everyone." Margaret had hesitated at first, her practical mind whispering doubts about time, money, and energy. But when she saw the spark of excitement in Clara's green eyes, so full of conviction, she agreed. The first class was small, only 6 participants, but the energy inside the shop was unlike anything Margaret had felt in years. Among them was Mrs. Fletcher, a short, round woman in her late 50s, with rosy cheeks and a boisterous laugh that filled every corner of the room. There was also Thomas, a lanky young man of 19, with sandy blonde hair and nervous eyes, who confessed he hoped to one day open a cafe of his own. The others were neighbors Margaret had known for decades, but seeing them now in aprons, their hands dusted with flour, made them seem somehow more approachable, more human. Margaret found herself smiling in ways she had forgotten she could. Watching Mrs. Fletcher knead dough with surprising strength, or Thomas tentatively shape rolls while blushing at Clara's gentle encouragement, filled her with a warmth that nearly masked her sorrow. She spoke with authority, explaining the delicate patience required when letting dough rise, the importance of feeling texture rather than only following recipes. When the class ended and the participants left with baskets of their own bread, their faces glowing with pride, Margaret realized Clara's idea had given them something more than customers. It had given them a community. The classes grew quickly. Word spread from one neighbor to another, and soon there were waiting lists. The bakery, once nearly empty, now pulsed with life. Clara thrived in her role as organizer, charming people with her easy laughter and kindness. Margaret noticed how her daughter had blossomed, no longer overshadowed by her younger sister's ambition. Clara's identity was no longer just the eldest daughter, but a woman in her own right, carrying forward a family tradition with dignity and creativity. Yet, even as the laughter and chatter swelled around her, Margaret carried her wound silently. In the quiet hours of night, when the bakery was dark and the town hushed, she felt the absence of Edward and Emily like cold draughts creeping into the corners of her heart. She would sit in her small bedroom, gazing at the empty side of the bed, replaying memories she wished she could forget. Edward's broad shoulders and warm hands that once made her feel safe were gone. Emily's voice, once sweet and eager, had twisted into something manipulative and cruel. Though Margaret tried to focus on what she still had, she could not stop mourning what was lost. One Sunday afternoon, Clara suggested they walk to the park after closing the shop, just to enjoy the crisp autumn air. On their way back, they passed by the old bakery building, now shuttered and vacant after Emily and Michael's hasty departure. Margaret paused, staring at the locked door, the familiar window where she had stood so many mornings arranging loaves. The ache in her chest swelled, but then something shifted in the corner of her eye. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, stood Edward. His tall frame looked smaller somehow, his once sturdy build thinned by time and guilt. His silver hair caught the dying light of the sun, and his deep-set eyes were fixed on the bakery as if it still belonged to him, as if he longed for the warmth he had abandoned. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she expected him to cross the street, to step forward, to say the words she had ached to hear. "I'm sorry." But Edward didn't move closer. His lips parted as though he might speak, but then he lowered his head. Slowly, almost shamefully, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Clara, sensing her mother's trembling, placed an arm around her. Margaret did not cry. The tears had dried long ago. What filled her now was something different, something quieter, a recognition that Edward's absence had carved a scar that no apology could ever fully heal. That night, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen after Clara had gone to bed. She lit a small candle and placed it on the table, staring at its flickering flame. She thought of how the bakery had been reborn, how people once again filled it with laughter and hope, how Clara had given her a reason to keep living. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a hollow place inside her, a wound that had sealed but would always throb with memory. She whispered softly into the silence, "I forgive you, Edward, but I cannot forget." The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn. She wrapped her cardigan tightly around her and entered the bakery kitchen. The air smelled of yeast and possibility. Clara soon joined her, humming as she prepared for the day's class. Margaret watched her daughter with quiet pride, and though the scar inside her would never fade, she realized that scars did not mean weakness. They were proof of survival. And for Margaret, survival had become her greatest triumph. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in hues of amber and rose, casting long, gentle shadows across the bakery windows where loaves cooled on the wire racks. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of fresh bread, vanilla, and sugar, wrapping the room like a soft blanket. The shop was no longer just a bakery. It had become the beating heart of the community. Margaret stood by the counter, her flour-dusted apron tied snugly around her waist, her once slouched shoulders now straighter, steadier. The years of betrayal and heartbreak still weighed inside her, yet she had carved a place of peace amid the storm. The bakery's transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. After the scandal, people flocked not just to buy pastries, but to stand in solidarity. Each week the classes Clara had introduced became more popular. Groups of townsfolk came in, rolling up their sleeves, laughing as they fumbled with dough or smeared icing too generously. Margaret, once tentative, now thrived in teaching. She explained techniques with patience, guiding hands that trembled with inexperience, and celebrating every small success. The walls that had echoed with the silence months ago now vibrated with chatter, stories, and laughter. One particular afternoon, the bakery hosted a class of 10. Among them was Mr. Hayes, a retired schoolteacher in his 70s, with a dignified stoop and silver hair combed neatly back. His wire-rimmed glasses often slipped down his nose as he focused intently on kneading dough. There was also Amelia, a young mother of 2, with wavy brown hair tucked under a scarf and a tired yet determined smile. Her children often peeked in from the window outside, giggling when flour dusted her cheeks. These faces, familiar and new, filled the bakery with more than just business. They brought life, resilience, and kinship. Clara shone in her role beside her mother. Her auburn hair, tied in a loose braid, swung gently as she moved from table to table, encouraging and assisting. She had found her voice here, no longer in the shadow of her sister. She carried herself with a quiet grace, her green eyes alight with joy when she saw her mother laugh with students. For Clara, the bakery was not just about survival. It was about rebuilding, about honoring her mother's sacrifices and ensuring her family's legacy lived on in a different way. Yet Margaret's heart was never entirely free. Each day she stepped into the kitchen, she carried invisible scars. Memories of Edward lingered like ghosts, the warmth of his hands when they built the bakery together, the betrayal when he chose silence over loyalty. Emily, too, haunted her thoughts, her smile from childhood now blurred with the coldness of deception. Margaret had survived their absence, but survival came with solitude. Nights remained difficult, quiet hours when grief crept in like a draft. Still, she endured because the daylight brought purpose, and purpose was her lifeline. On a late Saturday afternoon, as a class wound down, Clara nudged her mother toward the front of the room. The tables were cluttered with bowls, dusted with flour, and dotted with imperfect yet beautiful loaves baked by eager hands. The students clapped, cheering for one another's creations. Clara whispered, "Mama, say something to them. They should hear from you." Margaret hesitated. She was not accustomed to speeches, but as the room quieted, dozens of eyes turned to her with warmth, admiration, and gratitude. She cleared her throat, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. "You know," she began softly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "when I started this bakery decades ago, it was just me and a dream. I wanted to make something that brought joy. Over the years, I believe joy came from keeping everything together. My business, my family, my life. But life showed me that you cannot hold on to everything, no matter how tightly you try. Sometimes you lose things. Sometimes you lose people. But the most important thing," her voice faltered for a moment before regaining strength, "is not keeping everything, but keeping yourself. If you can protect your soul, your values, and your heart, then you have not lost at all." The silence in the room was profound, broken only when Amelia wiped tears from her cheeks and Mr. Hayes nodded with solemn respect. Then the applause began, gentle at first, then rising to fill the bakery with thunderous warmth. Clara, overwhelmed with pride, threw her arms around her mother. "I'm so proud of you, Mama," she whispered into Margaret's shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the embrace sink deep into the wound she carried, soothing it in ways words never could. As the class filed out, the golden evening sun spilled through the windows, painting the room in light. Margaret stood in the glow, her daughter's arm linked with hers, surrounded by the lingering laughter of her community. She knew she had lost much, her husband's loyalty, her youngest daughter's love, but she had gained something perhaps more enduring. She had protected her spirit, safeguarded her dignity, and built a legacy that could not be stolen. Outside, the town moved on with its simple rhythms. Children skipped down the sidewalks, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the world seemed at peace. Inside the bakery, Margaret felt a rare calm, not the fragile kind that could shatter with betrayal, but the steady calm of someone who had weathered storms and chosen to keep standing. As the day ended and the golden sky deepened into twilight, Margaret understood with clarity. She had not won in family, but she had won in herself. And that victory, though quiet, was hers to keep.